Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on solar issues. We have a very distinguished group of panelists to discuss these issues, and we're going to get to them in just a minute. We also are very privileged to have Senator Catherine Cortez-Masto delivering some opening remarks, and we're going to get to that in a minute. One thing I do want to let everyone know is that we will take questions from the audience toward the latter part of the hour. Please submit your questions in writing. We will get to as many as we possibly can, and we appreciate that input and that dialogue with you as part of our conversation today. As I think all of you know, our energy policy is committed to facilitating civil substantive dialogue on key energy issues and working with policymakers at the federal, state, and local levels to assist in their work on addressing these challenges that we all face. The other thing that I really want to do as we jump in is to thank our partners that support OEP and its work. So our thanks to all of them for their continued support as we hold our webinars, our live events, and our energy library, which I would refer all of you out there to for additional resources. It's the most comprehensive repository of energy materials online, well indexed and curated. So feel free to go to our energy library for additional materials on solar issues following today's discussion. What we're now going to do is turn this over to Senator Catherine Cortez-Masto from the state of Nevada. She is a Democrat, first woman ever elected from the state of Nevada to the Senate. She's a member of the Senate's Energy and Natural Resources Committee. She chairs the subcommittee on public lands, forests, and mining. And with that, I'll turn it over to her opening remarks to kick us off.
Hi, everyone. This is U.S. Senator Catherine Cortez-Masto of Nevada. Welcome to today's Energy Leaders webinar series on supercharging the solar industry. I want to thank Our Energy Policy for bringing together clean energy leaders to discuss such an important and relevant topic. The United States is in a unique position to lead the rest of the world in clean energy production, and Nevada has been at the forefront of solar development, and you can imagine why. Just look at all of the sun Nevada gets every year. We have the perfect state for solar energy. That's why when I first got to the Senate, I launched my Innovation State Initiative to make sure we're supporting emerging clean energy and solar technologies throughout the state of Nevada. I also led the fight for a solar tax credit that kept new companies and new jobs coming to Nevada. I got this tax credit extended and signed into law under President Trump and then expanded under President Biden. Now, Nevada has the #1 solar economy in the country, which has created nearly 9,000 good-paying jobs that support working families. I have spoken with workers of some of our solar arrays in Nevada, and I heard directly from them about how critical these jobs are for supporting their families. This is the power of leaning into our clean energy future. It's boosting our economy, it's bringing more jobs to our country, and it's a sustainable way to power our homes and our businesses. Just last month, I introduced legislation to expand solar manufacturing in the United States. The Reclaiming the Solar Supply Chain Act will make sure our clean energy economy remains competitive, and I hope you'll join me in advocating for its passage. Thank you again for having me today. We need to keep the conversation going about how we can effectively develop solar and other clean energy projects throughout our country. I look forward to continuing to work with you to keep the United States at the forefront of the clean energy future.
Thank you, Senator. And on behalf of both OEP and our co-host for today, IBERSUN and IBERSUN North America, which is a leader in the development of renewable energy, we're now going to turn to our panel. We have an outstanding group of experts to discuss the key issues affecting us with respect to solar. I'm going to introduce our moderator, David Murray, who is the Director of Solar Policy at the American Clean Power Association, long and distinguished career working in this field, and he's going to serve as our moderator today. David?
Thank you, Bill. And wow, that was an excellent message from Senator Cortez-Masto. She has really been essential to the work of our industry, not only on ensuring that we can continue to rapidly deploy solar energy, but on advancing innovation and manufacturing as well. So we're really fortunate to have her as a leader in Congress. And of course, if you live in Nevada, you have an excellent senator who is representing and advancing the solar industry. I first want to thank our energy policy for putting this session together. The solar industry is not only growing rapidly, but it's evolving every year. Based on DOE estimates, nearly half the nation's electricity needs will be met with solar power by 2035. So that means our deployment rate is going to triple in the next few years, and we're going to continue to touch communities, both rural and urban, across the country. And I couldn't think of a better set of panelists to help explore the dynamics of these challenges and opportunities today. So I'm going to introduce panelists separately with each question. And so to kick things off, since we just heard from Senator Cortez-Masto, why don't we talk about congressional affairs? So Ed, I'm going to start with you. So Ed Scarborough has an extensive background in telecoms and information technology, but over a decade plus, he has served as vice president at Distributed Sun for the last 10 years. And Distributed Sun is really a company that's on the forefront of innovative commercial, community, and utility scale solar and storage projects. So Ed, Congress really has a big opportunity here to advance transmission and interconnection issues that have really hampering the solar energy industry right now. So can you contextualize permitting reform as it relates to the solar industry and talk about grid integration issues more broadly as well?
Thanks for the question, David. The transmission interconnection is one of the biggest issues facing developers and renewable energy today. The DOE projects that the transmission grid needs to be upgraded by 60% by 2030 to accommodate all the growth that we hope to see. So this is really challenging. So there's really a couple of different parts to that. One is the process. It's very difficult to get through an interconnection process in any reasonable amount of time. But there's also a lot of challenges for the utilities and the transmission operators as to upgrade the grid. It could be 2 to 4 years in order to get delivery of a 10 megawatt inverter. So you have this permitting issue that needs to be streamlined and standardized across the country. We need to get the supply chains fixed, and basically we need to work together very closely in an open and transparent way. The queues also are very crowded right now. There's just a tremendous amount of projects in the queue, many of which will never actually be implemented. And so that we need to see some work in order to clean up those queues so that viable projects can get through the process much faster.
Absolutely. Next, I'm going to turn to Meghan Nutting, who serves as Executive Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs at Sunnova, which is one of the largest residential solar storage and EV charging solutions providers in the U.S. It's hard to have worked in solar policy and not cross paths with Meghan at some point. And so, Meghan, I'd love for you to help complement Ed's answer from the distributed generation side, sharing perspective on how Congress can really advance distribution system planning in the near term.
Yeah, there are a couple of things Congress can do, and all the way down to the state and very local level. One of the big things for distributed systems, sort of similar to large scale systems, is permitting. Permitting is really inconsistent across states, across even individual HJs, authorities having jurisdiction within individual states. There are some HJs where contractors won't sell systems because the permitting takes too long, it's too difficult, it's too expensive, and they ultimately have to respond to consumers who ask, what's taking so long, why is it so expensive? So there are certain areas where people won't even sell solar. And the same goes for long interconnection timelines implemented by utilities who aren't held to certain, to standards where they have to meet specific timelines and respond to consumers and consumer demand. One technology that's been built and that continues to be supported by the government, by NREL, one of the national labs, is the solar automated permitting process. It's a fantastic resource. I think in a look back study last year, it showed that it saved, I think, 50,000 days of permitting timeline waits. What we need from the government on that front is funding to adopt this tool. California right now has a mandate that jurisdictions over a certain size adopt solar app or some sort of automated permitting process. And they give out grants of, something like $40,000 to $100,000 to different age days to help them adopt solar app. The US government also gives out some of those grants, but they only go up to $15,000. So we've only had about 12 communities or 12 age days ask for that funding. So what we could use help on is faster interconnection and inspection and permitting timelines, and then funding to help adopt the tools that we've got right now.
As a Virginia resident who's been waiting for over 2 months for my county permit, I certainly hope that my county will adopt solar app. And then Megan, I also wanted to ask you about trade. Obviously, we've had a lot of difficulties with tariffs and which kind of complement or couple with supply chain issues. What can Congress do to help address some of the trade barriers that the solar industry has faced and really been passed on to consumers in terms of higher prices?
David, you're asking all of the good, hard questions. Yes, let's talk about interconnection inspection and trade. Yeah, there are a lot of tariffs imposed on solar panels. We have the original anti-dumping countervailing duties that were imposed in 2012, the Section 201 tariffs imposed under Trump and then extended under Biden. We have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which limits sort of where polysilicon can come from. And then we also have the recent auction petition, so an expansion of the AD/CVD duties. It's been a lot. It's made the supply chain pretty difficult, especially during the years where supply chain was difficult for everything because of the global pandemic and shipping issues. And so what we saw last year, predominantly because of these trade and tariff issues, was a contraction of 40% in the U.S. solar industry, and that was pretty frustrating. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, it took 8 months to finally sort of get panels out from under that, and for clarity on what CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, needed in order for people importing panels to prove that they were clean. I heard last December that 1,500 containers of panels had been detained, were sort of waiting on the other side of the Mexican border, and that only 7 had been released because no processes had really been put in place to kind of get those moving. And then obviously with the auction petition threat and the expansion of AD/CVD duties and the potential retroactive expansion of those duties, that really slowed down anyone who was going to import panels into the US. So obviously trade supply chain has been a significant sort of speed bump thing holding the solar industry back over the past year and a half, 2 years. We would love to see more domestic manufacturing, and I think we can get a lot of the way with with the incentives provided in the IRA for domestic manufacturing. Not all of it's perfect, not all of it is adequate, so there's still some things to work through. But I hope we're coming out on the other side of trade issues at this point.
Us too, and years of kind of the solar industry's boom and bust cycles, as well as sort of our own underfunding of our domestic manufacturing capacity. Our industry is largely reliant on Asian manufacturers for development, and so with the IRA, we now have a really renewed focus on domestic manufacturing. We've seen a number of exciting announcements across the U.S. And I'd love now to bring in Garret Nilsen over at the Solar Energy Technologies office to give us an overview of these issues. So Garret has over 10 years at the Solar Energy Technologies office. He's managed hundreds of projects that are aimed at driving down costs and increasing the competitiveness of the U.S. solar industry. So, Garret, can you talk about CETO's work in advancing U.S. manufacturing and international competitiveness?
Yeah, absolutely. And just thrilled to be here. Appreciate it, David, and great to be on here with such other great panelists. And we're certainly touching on the big topics right out of the gate here. And I'm certainly happy to circle back to any of the other topics. But out of the gate, the Department of Energy, traditionally is a R&D funding shop. So we spent a lot of time and over my 10, 12 years and even prior here, really trying to funding that next generation of technology with an eye towards domestic manufacturing. Now, of course, over the last decade plus, the U.S. has been on the forefront of developing some great new photovoltaic technologies, whether it's the modules itself, racking, tracking, inverters, et cetera. But as you're right, today, most of this is being made abroad. What we are excited is that, the Inflation Reduction Act does give us a line of sight to seeing manufacturing kind of be repatriated to the United States. We've seen dozens of manufacturing announcements representing, over 100 gigawatts of manufacturing capacity across the entire supply chain. Now, of course, it's going to take a little bit of time for these capacities to come online as people need to site their facilities, get shovels in the ground, and start to build things out. But we're working closely with the manufacturers, with the National Renewable Energy Lab and others to help support those who want to manufacture here in the United States. We're also committed to be working with the Treasury Department and others in terms of really defining and making clear what these incentives mean and how people can interpret them as they move towards building their manufacturing capacities here in the United States, with the ultimate goal of having that whole kind of poly to module supply chain here, so we can increase our energy security and make ourselves less reliant on international supply chains to deploy all the solar we need. So for us, it's about working within the bounds that we have of kind of the new tax policy world that we are inside of, but also continuing to drive that R&D in terms of developing that next technology or that next company, so we can make sure that when we build out manufacturing capacity now, it's not only competitive in the near term over the duration of the Inflation Reduction Act, but also into the future as we look to bring more advanced technologies online here in the United States, so we can turn ourselves back into the technology leader on the manufacturing side.
Thank you, Garret. And Ed, I'd like to bring you in here because as a larger developer, you all often have those longer development cycles and are able to kind of see these issues holistically, both in terms of panel producers, but trying to understand where the market is going in the long term. So can you talk about how supply chain and tariffs is affecting the larger scale market and how you all are looking at some of the announcements that Garret noted in terms of your long-term strategy?
Yeah, and I think Meghan really covered it well. The problem is a stop-start reaction to this continuing back and forth on tariffs for foreign goods, and developers need certainty going forward in their supply chain. And I would say it's more than just the panels. It's the inverters, it's all the other things, and we're all adding batteries now to our projects. We're concerned about battery supplies and even the underlying minerals and the amount of mining that's going to have to be done to supply those going forward. So part of what we need is some type of roadmap on availability of all the components of the supply chain and the rules and regulations around them, and to try to get from this reactionary approach that we've been subject to over the last couple of years. Having a clear roadmap and understanding what the rules are will adapt. Not knowing what they are, it spooks the investors, and it makes it very difficult for developers to understand what their costs are going to be, and then to explain to their customers what their total cost of ownership returns are going to look like.
Yeah, maybe if I can just pop in here real quick. I think, Ed's right on in that, while my answer was very focused on kind of the cell and module space, which I think is what a lot of us really think about when we think about solar manufacturing, it's the entire supply chain that we need to be thinking about it beyond just simply modules themselves. So yeah, racking, tracking, inverters, we need transformers, we need all of the other very large scale hardware in large volumes over the decades to come to be able to do this. So it's something that expands beyond solar energy. I know the Department of Energy is taking, very seriously everything from inverters and solar hardware, but also, going out to things like transformers and everything that goes into different substation upgrades and things of that nature to really make sure that we have that deep bench on not only in terms of what we're going to need to build out like a more electrified, grid and a more electrified economy, but also so that we can be ready and more resilient as a nation when we're struck by things like, more impactful weather events that are coming from climate change and things of that nature. So we really need to make sure that we have all of those available at our fingertips. And I will put in a really quick plug. Our office put out a supply chain white paper recently. It's called Building a Bridge to a More Robust and Secure Solar Energy Supply Chain. I'll pass it along to the folks hosting the webinar so that they can share it with all the attendees. But it's another kind of just look under the hood, at least in terms of how the Solar Energy Technologies Office is looking at building the supply chain here in the United States. But I just wanted to echo that the importance of what Ed was saying in terms of the broad nature of all the products that we need.
And if I could just add, even within panels, it's not just the final panel that we're looking to be manufactured here, but we have polysilicon, ingots, wafer cells, and then modules. I think there's been about 45 gigawatts of new domestic module manufacturing projects announced since the IRA passed, which is incredible and much needed. We'll have to see how much of that actually gets built. But it's also important to keep in mind that we really have no meaningful wafer or cell production in the US. There's some planned capacity, but it's not nearly enough to meet all the demand that we're going to need, through the full value supply chain of modules. So we're still depending on that. We're still depending on, foreign countries for that. And at the same time, going back even one step, most of the machinery used to manufacture all these products is itself manufactured in other countries, namely China. So there's still a number of things to work through before we can have an entirely domestic supply chain here.
Yeah, sorry, I'll echo that also, that it's really important, not even just polysilicon and cells. We also need to be thinking about glass. We need to be thinking about domestic back sheets and all of those other elements that might not be specifically called out in the Inflation Reduction Act. And Megan is exactly right that the tooling and tool makers in that supply chain will also be increasingly critical as well as we expand here in the US. I know Europe and others are thinking about that as well, but it really is holistic beyond simply the end products. It's the inputs themselves and the tools that actually lead us to those final outputs that are going to be critical. So it's literally all of the above manufacturing need for the US.
And if the solar industry really proved itself through deployment and being able to rapidly grow over the last 10 years, I think manufacturing will really be that key challenge that we're going to have to face over the next 10 years. Because as you mentioned, Megan, there's so many parts that need to come together. And when you think about a solar facility holistically, there's a lot there. And if any one of those faces a constraint, then you have backlog challenges and whatnot. And so we've talked a lot about what happens inside the Beltway, both in terms of federal legislation and Congress, but those who are involved in the industry know that the rubber really meets the road at the local level. And if we are going to reach every community in this country, we're going to need to have a lot of friends and a lot of thought leaders, frankly, at the state and at the local level. And so, Ed, I'm curious if you could share the challenges and opportunities with individual counties, sort of not only their role in permitting, but how you see some of these local affairs issues play out. And maybe also share what Distributed Sun is doing to ensure that there's community benefits that accrue with the projects that you all are developing.
All right, great question. As Megan mentioned, this is a patchwork quilt that we have to deal with. Every locale is different. And there's a little bit of disconnect, especially when we go into a rural area where the customers for the project are going to be in some other area of the state, maybe a metro area or something like that. So the real question is, what is in it for the local people to have those sites that are going to take up a significant portion of their land, which is essential to their economic development. And one of the things that we've been focusing on with our proposals in Louisiana is on workforce development, targeting the counties and parishes surrounding the site where we're going to deploy the facility. An average 80 megawatt site needs about one full-time equivalent person after you've done the construction, and of course you have some ongoing maintenance as well. What we propose is to add an additional 4 people to that site, to that payroll, and then to work with the customers to enroll them through their internship and apprenticeship program so they can get the education, the expertise they need to get better jobs to support their families in the long term, and then to backfill those positions to rinse and repeat. We're getting great interest from customers in this approach because they have a real need for talent, for educated workers. We've even heard some interest from the utilities who have lineman programs, and they would like to use some of the people for that. There's also some fairness issues when you're dealing with these rural areas with workforce development, where it's possible you'd be taking over land that is the landowner's very excited about it, but it's tenant farmers. And so how do we give them an opportunity to benefit from what goes there? So we're very focused on making sure, especially as we have to move more and more to rural areas to serve the metro areas, that the places where we put the systems benefit, not just the places where the energy is delivered.
Absolutely. I think you captured that well, both in terms of jobs and tax benefits and other opportunities that particularly rural America has to benefit from the industry. Meghan, you noted county level permitting as one challenge on the residential side, and I'm curious if you could share to our audience about the roles that county leaders have in making residential permitting seamless and frankly cost efficient for solar companies.
Yeah. Well, I love hearing, what Ed's saying. My husband works for a utility scale EPC. So I hear about the utility scale challenges on a daily basis too, and completely agree with that just based on, what I hear in my daily life. And on the residential side, permitting is so inconsistent, I guess is what I would say. I'll call out a couple places just to give examples because they're entertaining. But we have Sunnova is headquartered in Houston, and we operate in 44 markets, states and territories across the US. And we work with a network of local dealers. So we have over 1,000 dealers who work and live in their communities and sell and install the solar that we help finance and support and provide O&M on. So I was talking to one of our dealers in West Virginia a couple months ago and asking him about permitting. And he said, sometimes it's really easy. In West Virginia, they tried to get a permit to do a solar system on a home, and the HJ, the authority having jurisdiction, said, I don't know, well, does the guy own the house? And the dealer said, yes. And he said, well, does he want you to do the work? And the dealer said, yes. And the guy said, well, I don't know why you need a permit then. So it runs the gamut from that in West Virginia to, for example, in New Mexico, they're having issues there with people drilling illegal wells on their property and using groundwater that's limited. And so in order to get a solar permit, you have to do a land site survey and prove that you don't have an illegal well on your land. And that's obviously not entirely relevant, not at all relevant to getting solar on your roof. It's an extra cost, it's an extra step. Some people may not want to do that land site survey for various reasons. So that limits their ability to get a solar permit. We have some states like California that limit permitting costs and permitting fees. There's a bill, I believe, going through the legislature now that does that. I think that caps fees at something like $450 a system. But then you have other states, for example, like New York, where permit fees aren't capped, and they can charge upwards of $1,000 just for a residential solar permit. And so when we talk about wanting to expand adoption, making the customers, process seamless, using rooftop solar to help with the energy transition, and then you think about all of the speed bumps along the way. So does the customer have to overpay for a permit? Does the permit take a really long time? If a community has an adopted solar app and they have staff leave, there might be some inconsistency in how permits are approved or even the timeline for doing that. And it all really comes down to the local municipality, whatever that level is it the city or the county level, deciding on how long it will take, what the process is, I believe there are some places where you have to show up in person. So line sitters are hired to just make sure you can stand in line in order to get a permit. Some places you can only bring in 7 applications at once. So you need to just pay people to, continuously bring permits personally into an office. So it's this patchwork that makes it really difficult for the 1,000+ local small businesses that we work with to try to do business and try to adequately serve their customers.
Absolutely. And Garret, DOE was helpful in advancing the Solar App program, which is addressing or attempting to address a number of the issues that Meghan raised. Can you talk about the research that CEDO is doing on social license issues and trying to resolve a lot of these challenges that are inhibiting the industry at the local level?
Yeah, I mean, first, we are excited at, how far the Solar App has come, but clearly there's a lot more to be done. As of May, it was about 32 communities on there, but we have a good queue of folks who are in there, and the queue is growing daily. We want to make sure that we can get people through there more expediently. And, just on the vein of stories about different sections of the country, that was a wild story about New Mexico. I hadn't heard that one before. But if you look at some places that have adopted the solar apps, like Tucson, Arizona, they've gone from 20 business days down to 0 to be able to do permitting. So we're really excited to see how that can proliferate itself. And just in terms of local communities in general, thinking about solar development, we have released a local government guide to solar development, which again, I'll also share that in the link, which is very comprehensive, goes through a lot of different case studies and how people have been looking at kind of deployment of solar. In terms of like that social license and getting people okay with the solar, like that is particularly a big thing for us. And then we're looking into with the wind technology office at large scale utility levels. And like questions around siting and getting people comfortable that is real. And people are worried about traditional loss of land use, whether it's agricultural land or other reasons. Issues that the impacted environment or wildlife, changes to the viewshed or character of communities. And so we're in the process of trying to pull together some programming, which will really be focused on technical assistance and bringing diverse parties together to see what can be done to smooth the siting questions in place. Because there's, I think, a lot of people who are still learning and still just trying to understand what solar is and become comfortable with it. And the more that we can be driving conversations, more that we can be delivering research that the labs and others are doing, to get everyone to understand why solar is being cited where it is and how developers can maybe potentially adjust what they're doing to make sure that it is aligning with the local community's interests, the better we think we'll be and the more sustainable solar growth will be into the future. But it's certainly something that is, a challenge today. And we're really hoping to bring all of the communities together that we can to look at this so we can identify ways and paths forward, not only through research itself, but of course that community engagement and driving discussion.
On that social license piece, I'm under the impression that if a project is supporting members of the community in a meaningful way, both in terms of jobs and economic development, but also reducing energy bills, there's often it's a lot easier to permit it. And Ed, I know that you all have developed a number of community solar projects, and as well as ones that support large customers. And so have you found that community solar is a way to maybe address some of those challenges with large scale projects and ensuring that community benefits can accrue?
Most of the community solar projects we've developed are like 5 megawatts or in that range. So they're not the same as a utility scale, but they still require a lot of the same environmental reviews that the larger projects require. I haven't really seen anybody in permitting offices look at the benefits of a project and change the permitting process or make it easier to get through. However, the real issue to be shown community benefit is in the local community, not in my backyard version. And then when you have to go to those town halls in order to get approvals from the HJs and the city councils and so forth, they're more interested if you can show them this is a benefit to their community and not just somebody farther away. So in that sense, I think community solar is a little bit easier because the communities can see that they are going to benefit from the project. And so for those local decisions, it is easier to get them through. We're seeing a big rise, and not in my backyard, across the country And I think a lot of that is because the developers aren't spending enough time explaining to the community the benefits they are going to receive and making sure they're receiving their fair share of those projects.
And one community that I think the industry has not engaged with enough is tribal leaders, and a lot of these tribes face particular regulatory hurdles towards solar development. And so, Megan, I believe Sunnova's worked with a number of tribes, and so can you share a little bit about your all's experience and where the industry needs to go in ensuring that solar is really accessible to all?
Yeah, I think it's critical that the industry, as you said, make sure solar is accessible to all in whatever form that takes. If it's rooftop solar, virtual net metering, community solar, there are programs renters can participate in, demand side management programs. If you have a smart thermostat, if you have an EV, Fermata Energy has some vehicle to grid technology, and their tagline is "Park it, plug it, profit," which I think is really great. So I think everybody needs to be able to participate in managing the demand side. And of course, that includes tribal nations. Sunnova has been really interested in partnerships with tribal nations. We're talking with a number right now about different projects, but we also did a big project with the Navajo Nation in northern Arizona through Empowered by Light, and helped energize a community center and some other buildings that hadn't had access to electricity. And I think that's something a lot of us don't realize, is that a significant proportion, not as significant, but of 60 and 20% of tribal communities don't have access to electricity. They aren't tied to the electrical grid. And so there's a lot that solar and storage can do to help serve those communities. And I know Garrett's office and others within DOE and the government are providing a lot of technical support, a lot of financial support, and resources to tribal nations. We just need to make sure the private sector needs to work hand in hand with them and with the government to make sure that those resources are used effectively and deployed quickly, because they need that done sooner rather than later.
And I would just say, in terms of like the potential of that space, my recollection is correct. Tribal land takes up something about 2% of the land in the United States, but it holds something like 5% of the solar potential of the United States. And so if we can really think about working with those communities, not only for their, obviously pressing internal needs in some instances, but also think about this way as wealth creation and energy export to other communities, we think we can really drive things forward. And so we've put out a guidebook around kind of addressing some of the challenges for tribal solar deployment. Our Office of Indian Energy has put together a kind of a tribal energy atlas, which is supposed to help communities understand what are the best energy resources that might be inside of their tribal facilities as well. And so we're really dedicated in terms of working with tribal land and to take advantage of the potential that is there, so that we can bring more wealth to these communities and export that energy to the United States. I did want to make one other quick comment on community solar, just because it had come up briefly, because there was something really exciting that came out a couple of weeks ago that I'm not sure everyone might have noticed. So the Department of Health and Human Services put out kind of a memorandum as it relates to their low-income home energy assistance program, which is now saying that recipients of that assistance can be using some of those funds for things like community solar subscriptions. And we're actually working with HHS on a tool that will help folks kind of be automatically enrolled, or at least opt in to be enrolled into community solar systems if you are recipients of LIHEAP support. And so I just think that's a really exciting kind of small rule change, and these sorts of things really can have big and lasting impacts, but it might have flown a little under the radar. So it came out on June 15th, and I can certainly share that information with our hosts as well to pass on to everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you, Garrett. And I know that we only have a few more minutes left before the audience takes questions over, and I see a number are pouring in, so I don't want to monopolize the questioner role. But I do think we really need to talk about net metering, especially when we talk about the future of the residential solar industry. And for those who don't know what net metering is, it enables a solar customer to basically feed their energy back to the grid and receive full retail compensation. So if I generate an extra kilowatt hour of energy, I send it to my neighbor, and the utility credits me at the end of the month of the year. And as we have more and more solar that's deployed. There's been a lot of state regulatory and legislative efforts that have looked to change and alter those rules, especially as if we're aiming to have 1 in 3 households have solar on their roof. So Meghan, I know that you are closely engaged on net metering policy across the country. Can you share a little bit about kind of the evolution of net metering and where you all see the practice going and how we expect it to change in the next few years?
Yeah, definitely. Net metering, obviously a very hot topic in so many states. I think one of my favorite reports is the 50 States of Solar put out by the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center. And they have a great graph showing which policies are considered by states throughout the year. And then each quarter, they have a quarterly report, and then how many states considered those policies. I think last year, 26 states considered changing their net metering policy in some way. So that's obviously more than half. This is a hot topic. As David said, retail rate net metering is when you get retail rate credit for any exports to the grid that you have. You don't get payments, it's a credit that you then use to offset a different part of your bill at a different time. There's a lot of conversations about lowering that rate to something else, and that's called net billing, if it's something other than retail rates. So sometimes utilities are pushing for an avoided cost plus X, so avoided cost maybe plus 4 cents. Arizona kind of started with one number and reduces that, which is sort of tricky calculation, but reduces that 10% every year. So there's different kind of approaches to lowering that net metering rate. Ultimately, net metering is a policy decision. It studies, including by LBNL, Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, have shown that it has really a limited to no impact on customer rates. And so it affects customer rates less than energy efficiency does, especially at penetrations less than 10%, which is pretty much everywhere except maybe California and Hawaii. And so having conversations about what that net metering rate is a policy choice. It has been shown that the higher the net metering rate, the higher the adoption of solar. The lower the net metering rate, the lower the adoption. And so what for states and individual, utility areas, what is it that you're looking for? Do you want higher adoption? Do you want lower adoption? We also now have increasing numbers of lower and moderate income customers adopting solar. And what sort of structure, what sort of policy structure should they have access to? And so it's a big conversation about equity in that respect, a big conversation about policy goals, about adoption goals, about where we want to go. If we aren't building rooftop solar, but we want to decarbonize our energy system, what do we look at then? Do we look at nuclear? Do we build only utility scale solar? What's the balance that we're trying to achieve? So it's very much a policy conversation. And I was just watching a video by Matt Farrell. I encourage you to look it up. It's on YouTube, talking about net metering, where it's sort of going, myths surrounding some of the claims that have been made about net metering and what that costs non-participating customers. But broadly, when individual consumers invest in solar and especially storage, which helps, kind of mitigate when that energy is sent to the grid, those investments can help lower costs for all consumers. And a number of studies have been done on this. Vibrant Clean Energy did one. I think Brattle just came out with one. When you have individual consumers investing in distributed systems, it means you can help avoid transformer upgrades. It means you don't have to build out as much capacity. It means you can manage the demand side better. It means you can not have to build out more peak capacity, which is about 20% of the system. So overall, that can reduce costs for everybody. So broadly, net metering is not so much a what is solar's value, it's a what policies and what goals do we have for our state or our region.
And I think a lot of these changes are happening because the solar industry has grown so fast that we're having a reaction by other stakeholders that are saying, wait a minute, maybe we want to push back against this policy. And I think we certainly see that from a land use perspective where ag interests and community members that maybe don't want to necessarily look at the panels or are uncomfortable with the initial land use change or saying, well, are there other places or ways that we can deploy solar in a way that doesn't create that conflict? And so, Ed, I'm curious. We have a question here about agrivoltaics or co-location of solar with, say, sheep grazing or bees pollinators. Can you speak to how distributed sun has looked at some of those opportunities about combining, energy generation with other forms of economic development or agriculture, and what some of those challenges and opportunities might be?
Sure. Some of our projects in New York use sheep grazing and habitats or bee colonies as well. And sheep grazing is actually more cost effective than some of the other methods of maintenance that we've looked at. And the bees seem to love it. We're also now beginning to look more closely at the different types of crops that will not only grow better under solar panels, but actually have been shown to have better nutrient value when they grow under solar panels. But that's very localized. So each geographic site has its own characteristics in terms of what makes sense and what types of products work. Obviously, anything that needs combine harvesting is not going to work on the solar farm. But especially with tilting panels, you can tilt them out of the way for some smaller equipment to go through. So we're looking at how to accommodate that as well. Again, I think the economics are there for the sheep grazing and the beekeeping, but I think we've got a little more work to do, and several universities are heavily engaged in this right now to make widespread deployment of agrivoltaics a reality. But we look at every site that we do with that perspective now and try to understand how we can implement.
Great. And before we turn it over to audience questions, Garret, I did want to mention that labor is obviously really key to all sectors of the solar industry, and certainly we're in a tight labor market now, and so DOE has done some interesting studies on workforce development. And so could you talk a little bit about where you all see the needs of the industry growing, and what we can do to help prepare for an industry triple its current size?
Yeah, sure. And so, roughly we have about 300,000 plus folks working in the solar space, a little bit more than that. But to reach kind of the goals that the DOE put out for solar deployment, we need about 500,000 to 1.5 million folks by 2035 working in the solar industry. So this is a very large number. And so, we're very focused on increasing that kind of funnel to get people into the industry. In our opinion, particularly on the installation side, like the training and curriculums exist. Right now, it's about tapping into the folks who can potentially take these jobs, turn them into careers, and then see where those careers go in that clean energy space. And 2 weeks ago, we announced 13 projects, or we announced $13 million worth of funding to 12 projects across the United States, looking at increasing that funnel and increasing the number of people involved in training. So this is everything from programming focused on Native American women, all the way through to some very kind of deep union-led and union-involved training programs. And we're very excited that most of these programs do have union engagement involved. A lot of them are dealing with local community agencies to be able to bring in more diverse folks into the industry. But I think one important thing too is making sure that not only we're getting people into the solar industry to be able to install solar or play whatever role that is, but also DOE is trying to think more holistically about how do we turn these things into clean energy careers. So if you are particularly adept at installing solar panels and you want to become an electrician to go work on, whatever it is in the employing, let's say EV chargers or things like that, we're also trying to think about that more holistic chain of folks. So people see this not as let me go install modules in a field for a few months for a local solar system. Like, how can that really turn into a longer term career in that space? And so we're very dedicated to doing that, and really excited to see where these new rounds or these new funding programs take us, that are, again, very focused on not reinventing the wheel curriculum wise, but really expanding the funnel to bring more people into the space.
Excellent. So with that, I will turn it over to audience questions. First of all, I think we've done a fantastic job covering a lot of key issues, but still a lot of things that we could do deep dives on in a subsequent webinar. We have a question here on brownfield. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Julia with Our Energy Policy, and the great discussion, everyone. And I can read off some of the questions now. Yes, so the first question is, can you discuss the potential to utilize brownfields for solar arrays and storage in urban areas?
Ed, would you like to take the brownfields
Sure.
question?
Yeah, we're excited about this. So obviously, we have to look at each site to make sure it's viable for you. But a number of states provide significant incentives for developers to look at brownfields, or even just relaxation of rules like co-located equipment. There may be say a 5 megawatt limit on how big of a system you can build, but if you're on brownfields and they're adjacent to each other, you can go ahead and build two of them together. That makes a big difference in the cost to the developers who deploy those projects. So I do think we need to see those types of incentives because there are extra costs and extra risks associated with that. But I think a lot of states are moving very quickly in that direction. I think you'll see more brownfield development.
And if I could just add, solar roofs are brownfields. They're, they obviously don't disrupt any greenfield. So all solar roofs or all roofs in urban areas are great brownfield options for solar development.
Maybe I just add one more item that it's not related to the urban areas, but the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act had money, $500 million, specifically looking at deploying solar and other sort of or the renewable assets on like former mine lands. And these are really like massive areas that have a lot of potential too for driving deployment in the future. So I think we really got to look at all possible brownfields, and this can help mitigate some of the siting challenges that we spoke about earlier, and hopefully do things like speed permitting and make people a little bit more comfortable with solar in their communities, as it's not taking away from other historically alternatively used lands.
Thank you. And now on to the next question. What are the biggest challenges for virtual power plants that incorporate solar energy resources?
I'm happy to talk about that. We, Sunnova, just announced a conditional commitment from the Loan Programs Office at DOE for a $3 billion loan guarantee program to help build out virtual power plants. I think there's a lot of different forms VPPs can take. It's obviously a very vague term that I think people interpret whatever way they want, which is great. For example, we've bid almost 200 megawatts into the ISO New England forward capacity market. So that is a version of a virtual power plant. There's a connected solutions program in the Northeast that pays people for battery capacity, a battery bonus program in Hawaii that kind of does a similar thing. There's a number of conversations happening in Puerto Rico about virtual power plants, but essentially any sort of aggregation and usage of that aggregation to help reduce load or help provide capacity, depending on what the need is a virtual power plant. I mean, the fact that we have millions of rooftops throughout the US producing energy and then sending, excess generation to their neighbors, that in itself is a virtual power plant. It's a distributed power plant, effectively. How can we get more adopted? I mean, we get more rooftop solar adopted. And then I think something that I feel very strongly about is customers should be adequately compensated for participating in these programs. And some, I think, do a good job of that. For example, California recently paid some battery customers, I think it was $2 a kilowatt hour for their excess capacity when there were capacity shortfalls. I think in Texas last week, if you had a battery, you could get $5 a kilowatt hour, at certain times because the grid was so strained. So those are huge. Like, I've never heard of numbers that high. It's kind of great. Like, you pay, I know everyone on here knows what they're doing in energy, but the average price of energy is what, like 8 to 16 cents a kilowatt hour. So $2 a kilowatt hour is a lot of money. So I think to get people to participate in these and use the assets they've invested in to help with the reliability and broader cost and safety of the grid, you have to compensate them fairly. And I think that ultimately is the crux of the success of the programs or not.
Thank you. And now our next question has to do with the materials used in solar panels. Can you all discuss the potential for the U.S. to shift away from silicon solar panels toward alternative materials like perovskite in light of trade issues and the goal of reducing dependence on China?
I'm happy to wade into that one. So I say today there is kind of one major alternative out there. So cadmium telluride modules, which are manufactured by First Solar. The US is the biggest market for those today. About 15 to 20% of the modules deployed here are of that technology. Now, that technology, First Solar is growing, but it is limited in the fact that there is only so much tellurium that is kind of a byproduct of copper and other mining that is available on an annual basis to be able to make solar modules. By our estimates, that's not going to be enough to be able to fulfill US needs. So looking to other, technologies, perovskites is kind of the most popular one today. It has shown incredible promise in terms of its ability to increase efficiency over a very, very short period of time in lab settings. And I just really want to emphasize the in-lab settings part of it. While it is showing higher efficiencies, people are starting to think about how to manufacture it at scale. We are seeing durability challenges for its deployment, actually on sun and at, scales that or size form factors, I should say, that would be needed for deployment more broadly. So we are investing heavily in terms of trying to understand those degradation issues, trying to work with people who are prospective manufacturers to understand how we can make these both long-term reliable and durable, but also repeatable over large volumes of manufacturing. But it is still quite a ways out. We put out a paper that I'm blanking on the name of, which kind of laid out our perspective on what we think in the future of the perovskites, and we think there is potential, but it's still a ways off before really impacting the marketplace and being something that could potentially usurp silicon. And its likely path to market is going to come in the form of some sort of tandem device being paired with maybe another perovskite silicon, perovskite CdTe, or something of that nature. So promising, yes, but there are still some major technical challenges to be overcome, and we're working hard at doing that.
I'm participating in this program called the NREL Energy Execs Program. Great program if anyone on this call wants to apply. And so I spent 3 days last week at the NREL labs. They showed us, it was very detailed. So we actually painted perovskite onto a piece of glass and saw the voltage increase. NREL is doing, and I'm sure other national labs. I just am based in Colorado and doing this program, so I'm partial to NREL, but NREL is doing incredible work on this front. Research, they're testing all of these things. As Garrett said, it sounds like perovskites break down pretty quickly. But if anyone can figure this out, I think it's our national labs and the R&D teams there.
All right, thank you. And now last question. Have solar panels reached an efficiency limit? And what is the most efficient solar technology now in production?
I'm happy to hop in on that. So there is physics that limits the efficiency that you can receive from, say, what's called a single junction solar cell device. And so the modules that we see out there in the world today are single junction devices. And with kind of like the latest cell architectures that we're seeing being put out, we're seeing modules that are approaching, 24+% in terms of efficiency. And so this is getting close to what is practical in terms of the manufacturing space. So that's why we are, investing in research, as I mentioned earlier, in the relation to perovskites, but even more broadly into tandem devices. So in this case, you're taking one single junction solar cell and tuning it to a certain band gap, taking another single junction cell and tuning it to another and laying them on top of each other. And this increases the upside of what is theoretically possible for a module. Now, nothing has been commercialized at this point. Companies are looking hard at that space so that we can continue to try and drive increased energy density over the same areas. So there's still work to be done, but if you look at it from like a theoretical standpoint, there are even other kinds of more exotic solar cells that are mostly used on things like satellites, where weight is a big issue, where you have 3 junctions or something like that can drive efficiencies up even higher. For folks who want to see the full pantheon of different efficiencies, there's always the famous NREL efficiency plots, which looks at the efficiencies of different devices and different kind of stacks of junctions over time. But so it's an evolving and technically, improving industry, and that just brings more challenges, but more opportunities for what can be next.
The rest of us are glad that we have a engineer like yourself on this panel, Garrett.
Happy to be here.
I hesitate to jump in because this has been a fascinating, insightful discussion. We could go on, as David indicated a few minutes ago, for hours. We don't have time today, but we certainly will follow up with this. And I particularly want to thank Garrett for noting several resources, which we will distribute to everyone, that were related to a number of the issues that our panel covered. Our thanks to the entire panel, Ed, David, Megan, Garrett, for this terrific discussion. It'll be posted online. I know a lot of you in the audience let us know that there were people who wanted to but couldn't make this time, but the recording will be up on the Our Energy Policy website within the next 24 hours. And I urge you to refer that to others who would have liked to have been here. Also, please take advantage of the Our Energy Library, which is on our website, which has numerous materials on this topic, as well as others as you do your work on these important issues. My thanks again as well to all of our partners supporting our energy policy and our co-hosts today, IBERSUN and IBERSUN North America, for working with us to put on this excellent program. So thanks again to all of you for taking your time. My thanks again to the panel, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar coming up in a few weeks. Have a good day and a good week. Thanks very much.